stage next time.
Thank you. And the reading today is from Matthew 5, verse 38 to 42. An eye for an eye. For you have heard that it was said, eye for eye and tooth for tooth. But I tell you, do not resist an evil person. If someone strikes you on the right cheek, turn to him the other also. And if someone wants to sue you and take your tunic, let him have your cloak as well. If someone forces you to go 1 mile, go with him 2 miles. Give to the one who asks you, and do not turn away from the one who wants to borrow from you. The word of the Lord.
I don't need it. You can keep it. Martin Luther King Jr. is probably one of the most well-known individuals from the 20th century. He was one of the leading figures of the civil rights movement that happened in America during the 50s and 60s. He is so significant to American society and culture that they commemorated his legacy by making a national holiday. However, Dr. King, surprisingly, wasn't very popular when he was here on Earth. In the 50s and 60s, his approval rating with American society was quite low. And not even just American society as a whole, his own peers, fellow African Americans were challenged and were questioned some of his tactics. They were unsure if his peaceful protest or his nonviolent approach to the aggression they experienced would actually work. And many African Americans thought that they should have faced the aggression with greater aggression. That we should make them notice, they would say. We should fight back. We should arm ourselves. We shouldn't just simply stand by in these peaceful protests and take it. However, Dr. King refused to bear arms or do anything more than peaceful protests. See, Dr. King foremostly was a preacher. He was a pastor. And that was his profession, and civil rights sort of came later in life for him. But for Martin Luther King, his influence, his inspiration, his template for how he was going to see change happen in America was through the Sermon on the Mount. What we're reading, what we're going through as a church right now. And specifically, these verses that just were read to you moments ago were the template for how he started the civil rights movement and how he predominantly faced the aggression that he experienced over and over again. But the question for you and I is, did it work? Did Dr. King's strategy, did it work? Was it successful? Did it reach the aim in what he wanted it to? See, for many of us, as we've been going through the Sermon on the Mount, we've been following along, and a lot of us look at Jesus and his words as inspirational and compassionate, but it's at this point of the Sermon on the Mount that we want to get off the bus, so to speak. It's at this point of Jesus' words about turning the other cheek, going the extra mile, giving to whoever, whatever they need, that we think that Jesus might be inspirational, but maybe he's a little bit naive. That Jesus, this sounds really good, but in the world, the real world, and where you and I live and we experience all of these different things, we're just not sure how rational this is. Jesus isn't very street smart. Because come on, Jesus, it doesn't actually work like that. In the real world, if I just turn the other cheek to every offense and abuse, and I just would simply be continually taken advantage of and experience aggression and injustice, we need to be able to fight back against violence because we need to keep violence in check. See, it's when we look at the Sermon on the Mount and Jesus' words that you and I have in mind the realities that we live in today. See, I have in mind when I read these words of Jesus of the aggression in Ukraine that is continuing on today. The unprovoked war that is now entering into the spring new campaign where both sides are intensifying their fighting. Some reports say over 350,000 people have already lost their lives in this. See, I have in my thinking about the reality of the civil war that's happening in Sudan, where two individuals did not want to compromise, did not want to meet in the middle, but they're both power hungry, decided to take their whole nation to war to see who would win. And an already unstable, impoverished country, now 1.6 million people are displaced. But even more closer to home, last week in Vancouver's West End, somebody was fatally stabbed to death. See, violence is all around us, and it's these realities that we're thinking of when we read Jesus' words, and the violence continues to plague our world. As advanced as we've become as a society, in our prosperity, our education, and technology, we still haven't been able to catch up with and find a solution to what to do with violence. In fact, this past century, the 20th century, was the bloodiest century on record. See, the question of violence and what to do with it is very much still at play for you and I. Welcome to church. My name is Jordan. I'm one of the pastors here. And if you're new, if this is your first Sunday, or if you've just been somewhere tropical, welcome back. But we're in a series titled Sermon on the Mount, where we're looking at Jesus' most famous teaching. It's found in Matthew 5-7, and in that he unpacks what it looks like to live in his kingdom. In this section of the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus is making these contrasting parallels. He's saying, you've heard it said this, but I tell you this. The law says this, but I tell you this. And every time Jesus is asking for a deeper, more inner commitment from his followers. And today we're looking at Jesus' approach to how do we address violence. How do we address the mistreatment and the aggression and the injustice around that? And so moving forward, how we're going to unpack this is we're going to look at two aspects. We're going to first look at the teaching which Jesus gives us here, which Brendan just read for us. That will sort of be the foundation that we are able to build our second part, which will be the implications. Based on the teaching, what is the implications for you and I? So let's jump in right with the teaching of Jesus. If you have a Bible, it's found in Matthew 5, 38. And this Sunday, we're actually going to spend a little bit more time in the teaching. We're going to go verse by verse and unpack it. We're going to grapple with the context around that. Because in my experience, this teaching many times has been confused or misunderstood or misinterpreted. And if we don't get the right teaching, then we won't get the right applications. The right teaching creates the right application. So we're going to take some time to unpack this today. Matthew 5, verses 38. You've heard that it was said, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. This is a common sentiment that you and I have heard in society, an eye for an eye, tooth for tooth, but this was even more known in the ancient world. See, Jesus is referencing one of the oldest commands, one of the oldest laws that we know of in human civilization. In fact, 2000 BC, the oldest writings that we've ever have around laws and different things like that, this was found in it. It's called the Lex Talionis. Lex Talionis is designed to ensure that individuals would not retaliate against wrongdoing, but the right punishment would be established. It's the old adage, the punishment fits the crime, which is still part of our legal system today, right? And so the Old Testament adopted this law and became part of their law and their framework. And it's found 3 times throughout the Old Testament, this Lex Talionis, this eye for an eye, this tooth for a tooth. And for you and I, when we read that, or when we hear that to our modern ears, this sounds barbaric, sounds primitive. I should say by the first century, they didn't take eyes out for eyes. If you lost your eye, they had monetary values for these things. But nevertheless, it sounds a bit primitive and barbaric, but in many ways, this was very much a progressive improvement in how to deal with violence. See, it eliminated the cycle of retaliation that was all too common in the ancient world. You steal my rake? Well, then I'll kill your cat. You kill my cat? Well, then I'll burn down your house. Will you burn down my house? I'll kill your... this is what movies are made of, folks. This is what would happen in the ancient world over and over again. So the Lex Talionis was designed forbidding individuals to take personal revenge. The courts would get involved, and the courts would establish the right punishment based on the crime. So the law was to limit revenge, but Jesus rejects revenge entirely. Verse 39, but I tell you. In other words, listen, I know that you've heard of this law, this Lex Talionis, eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, and I know it's the basis of your thinking. It's how you see the world. I know that it's center to your being, that every aspect of, no matter what your culture, society, we all agree on this, eye for an eye and tooth for a tooth. But I tell you, do not resist an evil person. couple things here. First of all, Jesus says, do not resist an evil person. Jesus is not some, head in the skies. He's not some of this utopia individual. He is well aware of the reality of evil in the world and evil persons doing evil things. He's not indifferent or unaware of it. I think that's important here. Jesus acknowledges that there is evil all around us. It's not saying that there's just simply, life's just good if we just do the right thing. No, evil's all around us. But how do we respond to it? Instead of retaliation, are we just simply to resist it? We're just simply to let it happen? It seems weird, right? When we look at this verse, it says, Jesus here says, but I tell you, do not resist evil or an evil person. That seems like on face value a little bit contrary to how even Jesus operated. Jesus himself in the desert resisted the devil. Jesus himself tells his followers at many different times to resist evil. The New Testament writers seems to be clear on that we should resist evil. So what's Jesus saying here? Well, the translation has got a little bit lost throughout the ancient Greek to our modern day English. But the word resist can actually be translated as revenge or retaliation. N.T. Wright says it best in his take on it. It better be translated this way, but I tell you, don't use violence to resist evil. Don't use violence to resist evil. In other words, how we respond to violence is not with more violence, but nonviolence. We don't retaliate, in other words, Jesus says. We absorb it. We take it and we break the cycle of revenge. It stops with us. That's Jesus' ethic. And for most of us, as we listen to that, we have lots of questions, don't we? How is that helpful, Jordan? How does that actually work? How can I just simply absorb it, or just how can I just simply take it all in and not retaliate or not make sure things are fair or even? Doesn't this just allow me to get abused or become a victim? See, we see lots of holes with Jesus' ideology here, Jesus' ethic, right? I think we can figure it out and plays itself out in the 4 examples that he gives. So Jesus follows up his ethic with 4 examples, and these examples are from his context, and so we have to do a little bit of work for them to make sense in our context. But within these 4 examples, he demonstrates how this ethic actually works and the brilliance behind his teaching. So I'm going to go through these quickly, the summary of these 4 examples. The first one, example number 1, if anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to him the other cheek also. If anyone slaps you on the right cheek, I think I need a volunteer for this illustration. Just kidding. I'm kidding. Some of you were very willing. Either that says something about me. But anyways, someone slaps you in the right cheek. So assuming my enemy is, across from me, if I'm going to slap him on the right cheek and I'm right-handed, what do I have to do? Slap him with the back of my hand, right? In the ancient world, this means nothing to us. This is just one way to fight dirty, whatever. But in the ancient world, to slap someone in the backhand was one of the most insulting ways to hit someone. It was dehumanizing of them. And in fact, in the East today, in the Eastern culture, hitting someone with the back of your hand was one of the most grievous acts. And so Jesus is not just saying any way of hitting, but he's saying in a way that would be seen as a sheer mistreatment of someone. Example number 2, if anyone wants to sue you and take your shirt, hand over your coat as well. In the ancient world, they didn't have H&M. They only had 2 articles of clothing. They wore them every day. They would have what's called a tunic, and the NIV calls it a shirt. The tunic was like all you wore, and it went next to your skin all the way down. And then you would have a coat to keep warm at night. That would be all you had. And so if someone's suing you for your tunic, they're literally suing you for the clothes that you're wearing, which means you probably don't have very much items or possessions, and you're probably in a position of poverty as it is. They're suing you for the very shirt that you have. So this would be a level of injustice and mistreatment and someone taking advantage of someone who doesn't have very much. Example number 3 in verse 41, if anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go with them 2 miles. Now remember, Palestine, where Jesus is speaking here, is an occupied country, meaning Romans Roman Empire and Roman soldiers occupy and control the land. And one way that they would want to remind you of your limited freedom and the tyranny that you experience every day is they could command any individual at any moment to carry their stuff for up to a mile. So you could be on a date. You could be going getting groceries. You could be on your way to work for your first day of work. You could be in the middle of something, and any Roman soldier at any point could ask you to come and take their stuff for up to a mile. In fact, we see this with Simon of Cyrene in the crucifixion stories where Jesus was carrying his cross. He could no longer carry it. Simon of Cyrene was no person in the plot. He was probably on his way to the grocery store or on his way home or his way to pick up the kids or something. And the Roman soldiers said, hey, you, come take this cross. Help us for the next mile. So just imagine just being a Jew at this point, and that every time that Roman soldier would ask you to take that as a reminder of your lack of freedom and the injustice and the cruelty that you experience day in and day out being part of an occupied country. Example number 4, verse 42. Give to the one who asks you, and do not turn away from the one who wants to borrow from you. Now, on face value, this one seems a little bit different than the rest. The other ones, we kind of get the injustice and the mistreatment and the violence around it. But this one is like, well, we should be charitable. We should be generous. But remember the context. Jesus says, do not return violence with an evil person. In other words, Jesus is talking about someone in this context that might be taking advantage of you, or some individual that doesn't have the purest motives in what they're asking for. Jesus gives us 4 examples of dealing with different moments of mistreatment, cruelty, and corruption, and injustice. And as he's giving these examples, every person in his audience who's sitting around him, who's listening to him, the blood would be boiling. They would be sweating. Their fists would be clenched. They would feel the angst and the anger and the retaliation and the misjustice because every single one of them has experienced these moments. So Jesus just didn't want to say, hey, don't return violence with violence. We don't retaliate with violence. That's not how we do that. And people are like, yeah, okay, that sounds good. But then he gave actual examples of the mistreatment and injustice that they would feel, and in that they would experience this desire to retaliate. So how do we respond? Right? How do we respond to this? How do we respond when we experience abuse or misjustice or these cruelty or these different moments? Well, psychology has now demonstrated that the human body responds to moments of stress and mistreatment in 2 primary ways. Fight or flight, right? You've learned this hopefully in psychology at some point anyways. It's a basic, primitive part of our thinking. It's hardwired into us. It's our stress response. It's just how we naturally respond to moments of stress or injustice. We will, whether we like it or not, we will fight or we'll flight. First of all, we will fight. We get slapped, well, we slap back. And we don't slap in such a way that's going to just simply hit them at the same thing. We hit them harder. We hit them in such a way that ensure that they'll never get up again, right? Or, we get sued for our clothing. Well, we double down and we sue them back. And we don't just sue them back for their shirt. We sue them for everything they're worth. Oh, I'm a fighter. I'm going to take you on. We take their bag, the Roman soldier bag, but on the way we steal half their possessions before we give it back to them. See, you see this vicious cycle that's happening, right? This vicious cycle of that is on display is that when we retaliate, we often don't retaliate with the same intensity, but a greater one to the original offense. We want to one-up them. We want them to know. We want to fight back. And this is a common mantra for many people in our society and culture. It's the idea is I'm not going to take it lying down. That I've been a fighter all my life, and people have been taking advantage of me, but no, I'm going to fight back. This is how I respond. And listen, whether you think you're more civilized or progressed than you and I, we all experience wrongdoing, and we all have had that feeling of retaliation. I don't care who you are. Every single one of us have had these moments when we experience something, and then we want to retaliate. I drive in Metro Vancouver, so I experience this often. And Amy says it's probably the most unattractive part of me is when I drive. It's when my humanity comes in full display. The other day I was driving down the road, and there's a street coming onto it, and then this car just turned out in front of me. I don't think they even looked. You know, one of those Honda Civics low to the ground, big muffler, you know it, right? The car had an N on the back as well. Cut me right off. And so I had to slam on my brakes. Jack's in the back's like, whoa, Dad. And what do you do when someone does something? Well, you want to let them know. I honked my horn to let them know that wasn't appropriate. And then you know what he did? This 17-year-old punk, he gave me the finger. He cut me off. And I just got to let you know, in the rest of that drive, I was following him, and I had every idea in my head of how I could retaliate. I was like, I know cops. I could call one. How crooked they could be here. Well, maybe I should cut him off. Or if I just hit the corner of his car, it'd probably slide it, you know. See, the reality is we have all experienced moments like this. Someone steals from you. Someone yells at you at work. Someone says something about you that's not true, and what do? We want to want to get even. We want to retaliate. This is a common part of the human experience. We're all too familiar. This is why they made 4 John Wick films. It's all based on this premise. We fight, and then the second response is we flight. We flee. We get out of here. We get slapped, but we go down into fetal position. We just take it. We allow them to take whatever they want from us. We walk the mile and whatever else they ask from us. We give to whoever and who asks, always giving, never taking our own agency, never fighting for us, never standing up for us. And I have seen this so often, and this is often seen as weak and passive, and it is. But it is a response that many of us have to the different things in our life, to the different realities. And this, for many of us, is because of all kinds of different circumstances. But we've learned it's just better to flee. We've learned that we just need to just run from these realities or just accept them as they are. And the sad reality is I meet people all the time who have been taken advantage on and trampled all over their life, and they just continue to allow it to happen because of one reason or another. We fight or we flight. And when I share Jesus' teaching here, many of you think I'm talking about the latter. Many of us think that Jesus' teaching here is that's this common approach that we should just simply accept the injustice that's happening. And even the expression turning the other cheek has become a euphemism to mean just take it. Just let it happen. But is this what Jesus is meaning here? Is this what Jesus is teaching us? But is there another way? Is there a third way? Is there a different approach? Is there a way that people living in God's kingdom people, is there a way that we respond to such injustice and violence and mistreatment that's different than simply fighting or fleeing from it? Well, Darrell Johnson, the beloved pastor and theologian, he pastors right here in Vancouver. His approach to this text, I believe, is the most helpful. This is what he says, quote, "There is nothing passive. There's nothing passive in any of Jesus' examples. Go on the offensive and act in a way that changes the dynamics of the encounter," Darrell says. There's nothing passive about Jesus' examples, but rather go on the offensive and act in a way that changes the dynamics of the encounter. Let me show you what I mean in reverse order here. So when it says, give to the one who asks of you, to the one who asks. It doesn't say give whatever is asked, give to whom is asked. There's a difference there, right? So it's about giving what is appropriate. It's about moving simply from requests to relationships. We know as parents, we just don't simply give our kids whatever they ask for. So it's about creating a relationship. It's about giving to whom. For example, number 3, go 2 miles. Before the soldier can exploit you by taking you for 1 mile, you turn the tables on them and you go for 2 miles. And the soldier's like, wait a second, that's not what I asked for. That's right, I'm not doing what you asked. I'm on a different narrative. I serve a different king. I have a different reality that's going on. Example number 2, when they sue you for your tunic, Jesus says, give them your coat as well. Now, I'm not sure, but I think Jesus is being funny here. Some of it's got lost in the last 2,000 years of translation and culture, but I think Jesus is being funny here. Because remember, all you have is a tunic and a coat. So if you just lost your tunic and now you're giving them a coat, you're there butt naked in the court, right? So Jesus is saying, listen, why don't you demonstrate their mistreatment of them by making a spectacle, by making a shocking example of their mistreatment by you just standing there naked, by you giving them everything. Then first of all, the first example, Jesus is not saying let him slap you on the cheek, but he says turn to him the other cheek. In other words, we are not passively to submit to evil, but to actively overcome evil by good. We are to change the dynamics of the encounter. We're not just having our behavior determined to us and how we are treated. So if other people treat us in such a way, then they determine how we are going to respond. Either we're fighting or fleeing, but we are in control of the narrative. See, this language that Jesus gives us, it's very active. And this is how we break the cycle. We are not simply merely puppets, but we are active participants in how we respond to the injustice that we experience. Dallas Willard wrote a great book called The Divine Conspiracy, and we've quoted it many times through this series because I think his observations on the Sermon on the Mount is really helpful. This is what he says, quoting on this verse. Or this section. As anger feeds on anger, so patient goodness will normally deflate it. Do you hear that? Anger, it feeds on anger. Anger, people want response. They want more anger. It's what feeds it. But you know what deflates it? You know what stops it in its tracks? Patient goodness. They don't know what to do with that. He goes on, he says, and we, followers of Jesus that live in his kingdom, for our part, following the order of Jesus' teaching and example, have already dealt with our anger, contempt, and fantasized desires, said, you do not come into play. Remember the order this is in the Sermon on the Mount. See, at this point, Jesus is talking about being people of the Beatitudes and dealing with our contempt and our anger and our fantasized desire. We've dealt with those things, so they have no control on us anymore. And so they have no control, they don't come into play. And so our response when we experience these moments is allows the kingdom of God with all of its resources to begin its work. We venture on the kingdom, as we've already said, and suddenly our attackers, or the ones imposing upon us, sense they are not playing the game they thought they were, that they are not in control. Their behavior will in most cases undergo radical change and will always be profoundly affected. That is why one who stands with Jesus in his kingdom never worry about becoming a doormat. We change the dynamics of the encounter. We go on the offensive. We respond with evil with good. We overcome it by that way. See, Jesus' teaching here, I believe, is brilliant. It is profound. And I believe it's the way that we address the violence in our world. Erica Chenoweth and Maria J. Stefan examined 323 major armed and unarmed insurrections from 1900 to 2006. In their book, Why Civilian Resistance Works, they report an amazing result. Nonviolent resistance campaigns were nearly twice as likely to achieve full or partial success as their violent counterparts. Nonviolent resistance campaigns were nearly twice as likely to achieve their goals as those of their violent counterparts. So what are the implications for you and I? Well, Jesus doesn't ask us to live anything that he doesn't first live. And Jesus' life is a demonstration of this teaching. See, Jesus was wrongfully charged, unjustly found guilty, mocked, beaten, and then ultimately killed. And even through all of that, his dying words on the cross, one of the last things he says is, Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they're doing. This was such a contrasting way of responding to such violence and such injustice that the Roman soldier there, whose career was to crucify people, has probably seen hundreds, if not thousands of people crucified over his career. He was in shock. He didn't know how to respond. He was so taken back by how Jesus responded from that. See, Dietrich Bonhoeffer says we need to be a visible participation in his cross. In other words, we need to be the kind of people that Jesus' illustrations are made of. See, the early church, they embodied this. They didn't take Jesus' words as some utopia thinking or some just reality that doesn't work, but they took Jesus' words as face value here, and they became a nonviolent movement, which was quite amazing because they experienced mass persecution, many moments of injustice and even killings in some cases. But in fact, the first 400 years of the movement of Christianity was a pacifist movement. This all changed when Constantine, the Roman Emperor, converted to Christianity and then making Christianity the official religion of the Roman Empire, and then we see the marrying of the church and state for the first time. That's a sermon for another day. But out of that, we see prominent theologians like Augustine start suggesting for the first time in the history of Christianity about such things as just war ideology. That sometimes there's reasons for us to fight back and to take up arms. Now, in a room of this diverse and a community that's young like ours, the reality is Christians differ on the applications of these verses. Many heartfelt, loving Jesus individuals think differently of how we apply these verses to our everyday life, which is okay. And we as a community can continue to gather and be a community and think differently about these things. And I know as I present Jesus' teaching, in the back of many of your heads is a long list of questions. There's complexity here. We have these questions, questions such as, are there any times that violence is necessary? And what about other people? Do we defend those who are experiencing abuse? Is self-defense different than what Jesus is talking about here? Or there's this obvious pushback that you're thinking, yes, Jordan, that's easy for you to present Jesus' nonviolence approach, and you have the freedom to express that opinion because you live in a nation that has that freedom because people have fought and died for that reality. Or some of you are thinking, but does Jesus simply just mean personal retaliation, or does he mean that this should be more widespread? And what can followers of Jesus be involved in? And I could go on and on and on. There is complexity here. And my whole point is that we simply just can't listen to the sermon or these 4 verses of Jesus and put them aside and move on to the rest of the Sermon on the Mount. We need to take some time and wrestle with these implications. All I'm saying is small group discussion will be interesting this week. So if you haven't been for a while, you should make it out. I'm giving you an invitation today. Each and every one of you, regardless of your background, I'm giving you an invitation to consider the words of Jesus here. And not just some ancient words, but some words that I believe are actually profound and relevant and give us a pathway for how we deal with the injustice and the mistreatment that we deal with on a day-to-day basis. So please, don't simply just put me in a box as some type of millennial pacifist pastor. Nor just put Jesus' words in a box of unrealistic, but would you invite the Holy Spirit to speak to you, to take a moment, consider what Jesus is directing you to based on these words. William Barclay, the great New Testament theologian, this is what he says about this passage of Scripture. Few passages of the New Testament have more of the essence of the Christian ethic in them than this one. Here is the characteristic ethic of the Christian life and the conducts which should distinguish the Christian from other men and women. In other words, Barclay says, this is one of the most defining characteristics of the church. We don't take revenge. We don't retaliate. We don't use violence with violence. We have a different way of seeing the kingdom of God come to fruition. I'm inviting the keys to come back, and I want to close with this final thought. When you look at church history, think about the worst moments of it. Think of the very worst moments. Think of your friend you work with, and somehow Christianity became a conversation, or Jesus, and they asked you the inevitable question at some point, well, what about the Crusades? Think about the worst moments in Christian history, about the Crusades, where they took this just war ideology and they moved it from a just war ideology to a holy war. And then popes and religious leaders began to create reasons why actually bearing arms and actually going on the offensive was actually a spiritual, religious thing. The Crusades, the Spanish Inquisition, and just persecution of different ethnic groups, especially through the Middle Ages, is peppered throughout the church history. All why? Because they justified that we need to retaliate, that we need to face violence with violence, and we need to take arms. But the opposite is true as well. That some of the best moments, some of the most beautiful moments of the church, some of the moments where the church becomes the church is when these teachings of Jesus has just not simply been an ideology, but people have taken them to heart. And under much persecution and much pushback and much lack of fanfare, they lived these words to be true. There's many examples from history I can give you, but I want to give you another one from the 20th century. Another significant historical figure. Nelson Mandela lived in South Africa. And he went to South Africa after the Second World War. And South Africa in this time was part of the apartheid, which meant just a small minority of whites ran the whole country and had all the power, even though it was a majority African or black country. And the apartheid regime was brutal. It was violent. There's lots of injustice in so many different places. The stories of it are just too gruesome to share. And so Nelson Mandela was trying hard with others to make change here happen, to see the apartheid, the ending of the apartheid regime to happen. And through many different ways and many different tactics and many different ideologies and different political ways and different movements, he came to the point that he says, the only way I could do this is with violence. And so he started working with some other extreme revolutionary individuals, and he started to make plans for guerrilla warfare against the government, but his plans were intercepted from the government, and he was then sentenced to life imprisonment. Mandela went to prison, life imprisonment, as a young, angry revolutionist. But he left decades later as a peaceful, considerate leader who brought the end to the apartheid. What changed? Well, the teachings of Jesus, the Sermon on the Mount, the idea of turning the other cheek, radically changed his life. He saw what Gandhi was able to do in India, and he began to read the words of Jesus afresh. In a country, when he came out of prison, a country was deeply divided on the edge of civil war, and Mandela could have ignited, incited the crowds, but he called them to things such as reconciliation and forgiveness and a nonviolent change. Desmond Tutu followed with that and created these moments of reconciliation and forgiveness, and we saw the end of the apartheid and the transition of government almost with no casualties in almost a peaceful way. Nelson Mandela is famous for saying, resentment is like drinking poison and hoping it will kill your enemies. See, Mandela found another way, the Jesus way, the way of forgiveness and reconciliation, the way of absorbing the injustice and responding with nonviolence because it neutralizes it. This is to be the characteristic of the church. This is to be the distinguishing factor of you and I. This is how what we are to be known from, and it is off-putting and it is unusual. Because this is not how our world responds to injustice. This is not how our world responds to mistreatment. We either fight or we flee, but there is a third way for you and I. And it is to change the narrative. It's to respond evil with good. I'm going to invite you to stand, and I'd love to pray for you before we wrap up. The team's coming back. I'm inviting the prayer team to come forward as well, and we're just going to follow up with a time of ministry, and the team has a song for you. And the prayer team's coming, and they're available, and they love to pray for you in this time. But let me just pray for you. Father, I thank you. I'm thankful for your teaching. I'm thankful that we have your teaching today, that Lord, that is a template for us, that we can emulate the ways that you've set for us. I pray for my brothers and sisters in this room, and I just pray for the reality of this teaching to sink deep into their spirit, into their gut, into their very soul. May this just not be some words of Jesus that we put on a coffee mug, but may this be the ethic in which we live our lives. May we radically experience the grace of God, and may we give us the courage. Holy Spirit, give us the courage as a community to respond in a different way. So, Father, may we be reminded of your goodness today. Holy Spirit, would you just fill us with your love and your power in ways that allows us to do the hard things, to do the courageous things. May we as a church here in Burnaby, may we be defined differently. May we have a different way of going about things. May the characteristic of this place is that we address violence with nonviolence. We address injustice with overcome it with good. May we be people of your kingdom. So Jesus, we ask all these things, not just simply by our own willpower, but following the right steps or a good sermon or a good worship service or having the right people. We ask all these things in the name of the one who overcame the grave, in the name of the one who sits at the right side of the Father, in the name of the one who broke the bondage of sin, that broke the realities that have overcome us, and so we have freedom today. We ask all these things in your name. Amen. Let's sing.